Hello guys, here Gab again. We're going to talk about a little bit about repository pattern with unit of work, including entity framework core and performance. So the fastest way to destroy a clean architecture code base is letting entity framework leak into your application layer. Okay, so and the second fastest way to do that is implementing repositories that quietly kill performance. So today I'm covering two patterns that people often misuse: repository pattern and unit of work, specifically in entity framework core and specifically with performance in mind. The goal is simple. We need to keep the application clean, we need to keep the persistence details in infrastructure, and we need to avoid slow generic data access patterns. Why we use repository patterns, you may ask? Well, we can use repository pattern to abstract data access. Okay, we abstract the data access to the database and to prevent the application layer from knowing the details about the entity framework core or the database. That's why, for example, the application layer does not know the technical implementation details, and that resides on the infrastructure layer. Okay, the application should express business intent and use cases. I repeat, the application should express business intent and use cases. The what, not the how, for example. Okay, it should not care if the persistent is or a direct SQL or a store procedure or entity framework or something else tomorrow. Okay, if the application start thinking in DbContext terms, your architecture is already drifting. So we know the database context or the application database context. Okay, we use it to wrap the SQL or the connection to the database. We bind it to the entity framework and so on. If that resides and exists in the application layer, we are screwed. Okay, so here is the real problem. Repositories can easily become a performance bottleneck. Okay, I repeat, repositories, the repository pattern, remembering that repositories is an abstraction of the data access. The repository can easily become a performance bottleneck when, especially when they become generic. Okay, so how do we prevent the repository pattern from affecting the performance? We could use avoiding generic repository methods like GetAll or else FindBy. Okay, why un GetAll and why a FindBy? Because these methods usually leads to overfetching, unpredictable query shapes, materializing too much data, and pushing filtering into memory by accident. We have a cause and we have an effect. Okay, they look convenient, have all sort of generic methods in our base repository, for example, but it's not usually the best way to proceed. Instead, what we can do? We can do small and specific repositories, meaning each repository method should represent a real query or a real operation that the system needs. So the repository becomes intentional, it becomes predictable and performance friendly. This is how you keep clean architecture without sacrificing speed. Adding a little more from the unit of work perspective, because we talk about repository patterns and some relationship with entity framework, but we can also talk about the unit of work. It's about this pattern. What does this pattern? It centralizes something, right? The unit of work coordinates the changes and defines the transactional boundary. Okay, it centralizes the changes in the database. above all, because we are working with microservices, we have only one database with n tables, for example, but we have microservices with one database, and we translate that database, coordinating the changes within the unit of work pattern. Okay, we define the boundaries of the transaction we make there with the unit of work pattern. With entity framework, we have something that is the database context that naturally fulfills the role of the unit of work. We can use the pattern of the unit of work. We can create a class of unit of work and define there the operations of the transactions. We have the repositories, the models, and so on. But we can also use we mix both the DbContext and the unit of work, because the DbContext tracks the changes, applies transactions, and persists everything with a method that we already know that is called SaveChanges. Okay, and this separation is important because the application does not handle transactions or save changes. I repeat, the application does not handle transactions or save changes. The application is like the orchestrator. It only knows what it must be done. It follows the business rules, but their implementation it's handled in the infrastructure. Okay, the application says what would happen, and the infrastructure decides how it's persisted safely and transactionally. Okay, so the key practices we follow: one, database context per request scoped. 2, reads reads use the as no tracking to no track things if we are only reading and not writing. If you are writing, if we are making changes, for example, we can use the e queryable. Okay, but if we are only listing or fetching entities and so on, nothing more. If we are not changing the state, we only use the as no tracking. For API responses, we use projections to DTOs, and ideally control the save changes, ideally once per use case. Okay, this combination gives us performance stability, memory usage under control, and responsibilities clean across the layers. We have to remember this: repository is about abstraction and intention, not convenience. Repository is about we abstract the data access, how we communicate with the database model, with the server, and the unit of work is like one transactional boundary that centralizes the coordination of changes, nothing more. So, in summary, entity framework core leaking into application is architectural debt, so we need to avoid that. We also have to avoid the GetAll. We also have to avoid the FindBy. Here in entity framework core, we have the database context that the database context is like our unit of work. We can work with both, but it's basically similar. The application should not call save changes, and one database context per request per use case. Okay, so hope this is helpful to you. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and have a good day.